Section 61 of Popular Tales from the Norse.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 61. The Big Bird Dan. Once on a time, there was a king who had 12 daughters, and he was so fond of them they must always be at his side. But every day at noon, while the king slept, the princesses went out to take a walk. So once, while the king was taking his noontide nap, and the princesses had gone to take their walk, all at once they were missing, and worse, they never came home again. Then there was great grief and sorrow all over the land, but the most sorry of all was the king. He sent messengers out throughout his own and other realms, and gave out their names in all the churches, and had the bells tolled for them in all the steeples. But gone the princesses were, and gone they stayed, and none could tell what was become of them. So it was as clear as day that they must have been carried off by some witchcraft. Well, it wasn't long before these tidings spread far and wide, over land and town, ay, over many lands. And so the news came to a king ever so many lands off, who had 12 sons. So when these princes heard of the 12 kings' daughters, they asked leave of their father to go out and seek them. They had hard work to get his leave, for he was afraid lest he should never see them again. But they all fell down on their knees before the king and begged so long, at last he was forced to let them go after all. He fitted out a ship for them, and gave them Ritter Red, who was quite at home at sea, for a captain. So they sailed about a long, long time, landed on every shore they came to, and hunted and asked after the princesses, but they could neither hear nor see anything of them. And now a few days only were wanting to make up 7 years since they set sail, when one day a strong storm rose, and such foul weather they thought they should never come to land again, and all had to work so hard they couldn't get a wink of sleep, so long as the storm lasted. But when the 3rd day was nearly over, the wind fell, and all at once it got as still could be. Now they were all so weary with work and the rough weather, they fell fast asleep in the twinkling of an eye. All but the youngest prince. He could get no rest, and couldn't go to sleep at all. So as he was pacing up and down the deck, the ship came to a little island, and on the island ran a little dog, and bayed and barked at the ship, as if it wanted to come on board. So the prince went to that side of the deck, and tried to coax the dog, and whistled to him. But the more he whistled and coaxed, the more the dog barked and snarled. Well, he thought it a shame the dog should run about there and starve, for he made up his mind that it must have come thither from a ship that had been cast away in the storm. But still He thought he should never be able to help it after all, for he couldn't put out the boat by himself. And as for the others, they all slept so sound he wouldn't wake them for the sake of a dog. But then the weather was so calm and still, and at last he said to himself, "Come what may, you must go on shore and save that dog." And so he began to try to launch the boat, and he found it far easier work than he thought. So he rowed ashore and went up to the dog. But every time he tried to catch it, it jumped on one side, and so it went on till he found himself inside a great grand castle before he knew where he was. Then the dog, all at once, was changed into a lovely princess, and there on the bench sat a man so big and ugly, the prince almost lost his wits for fear. "You've no need to be afraid", said the man. But the prince, to tell you the truth, got far more afraid when he heard his gruff voice. "For I know well enough what you want. There are 12 princes of you, and you are looking for the 12 princesses that are lost. I know too very well whereabouts they are. They are with my lord and master, and there they sit, each of them on her chair, and comb his hair, for he has 12 heads. And now you have sailed 7 years, but you'll have to sail 7 years more before you find them. As for you, you might stay here and welcome, and have my daughter, but you must first slay him, for he's a hard master to all of us, and we're all weary of him. And when he's dead, I shall be king in his stead. But first try if you can brandish the sword." Then the king's son took hold of a rusty old sword which hung on the wall, but he could scarce stir it. "Now you must take a pull at this flask", said the Troll, and when he had done that, he could stir it, and when he had taken another, he could lift it, and when he had taken a third, he could brandish the sword as easily as if it had been his own. "Now when you get on board", said the Troll Prince, "you must hide the sword well in your berth, that Ritter Red mayn't set eyes on it. He's not man enough to wield it, but he'll get spiteful against you, and try to take your life. And when 7 years are almost out, all but 3 days", he went on to say, "everything will happen just as now. Foul weather will come on you, with a great storm, and when it is over, you'll all be sleepy. Then you must take the sword and row ashore, and so you'll come to a castle where all sorts of guards will stand, wolves and bears and lions. But you needn't be afraid of them, for they'll all come and crouch at your feet. But when you come inside the castle, you'll soon see the Troll. He sits in a splendid chamber, in grand attire and array. 12 heads he has of his own, and the princesses sit around them, each on her chair, and comb his head, and that's a work you may guess they don't much like. Then you must make haste, and hew off one head after the other as quick as you can, for if he wakes and sets his eyes on you, he'll swallow you alive." So the king's son went on board with the sword, and he bore in mind what he had come to know. The others still lay fast asleep, and snored, and he hid the sword in his breast, so that neither Ritter Red nor any of the rest got sight of it. And now it began to blow again, so he woke up the others, and said he thought they oughtn't to sleep any longer now, when there was such a good wind. And there was none of them that marked he had been away. Well, after the 7 years were all gone but 3 days, all happened as the Troll had said. A great storm and foul weather came on that lasted 3 days, and when it had blown itself out, all the rest grew sleepy and went to rest. But the youngest king's son rowed ashore, and the guards fell at his feet, and so he came to the castle. So when he got inside the chamber, there sat the king fast asleep, as the Troll prince had said, and the 12 princesses sat each on her chair and combed one of his heads. The king's son beckoned to the princesses to get out of the way as quick as ever he could. They pointed to the Troll, and beckoned to him again to go his way as quick as ever he could. But he kept on making signs to them to get out of the way, and then they understood that he wanted to set them free, and stole away softly one after the other, and as fast as they went, he hewed off the Troll king's heads, till at last the blood gushed out like a great brook. When the Troll was slain, he rowed on board and hid his sword. He thought now he had done enough, and as he couldn't get rid of the body by himself, he thought it only fair they should help him a little. So he woke them all up, and said it was a shame they should be snoring there, when he had found the princesses, and set them free from the Troll. The others only laughed at him, and said he had been just as sound asleep as they, and only dreamt that he was man enough to do what he said. For if anyone was to set the princess free, it was far more likely it would be one of them. But the youngest king's son told them all about it, and when they followed him to the land, and saw first of all the brook of blood, and then the castle, and the Troll, and the 12 heads, and the princesses, they saw plain enough that he had spoken the truth, and now the whole helped him to throw the body and the heads into the sea. So all were glad and happy, but none more so than the princesses, who got rid of having to sit there and comb the Troll's hair all day. Of all the silver and gold and precious things that were there, they took as much as the ship could hold, and so they went on board, all together, princes and princesses alike. But when they had gone a bit out on the sea, the princesses said they had forgotten in their joy their gold crowns. They lay behind in a press, and they would be so glad to have them. So when none of the others was feeling to fetch them, the youngest king's son said, "I have already dared so much, I can very well go back for the gold crowns too, if you will only strike sail and wait till I come again." Yes, that they would do. But when he had gone back so far that they couldn't see him any longer, Ritter Red, who would have been glad enough to have been their chief, and to have the youngest princess, said, it was no use their lying there still waiting for him, for they might know very well he would never come back. They all knew too how the king had given him all power and authority to sail or not as he chose, and now they must all say 'twas he that had saved the princesses, and if any of them said anything else, he should lose his life. The princes didn't dare to do anything else than what Ritter Red willed, and so they sailed away. Meanwhile, the youngest king's son rode to land, went up to the castle, found a press with gold crowns in it, and at last lugged it down to the boat and shoved off. But when he came where he ought to have seen the ship, lo, it was gone. Well, as he couldn't catch a glimpse of it anywhere, he could very soon tell how matters stood. To row after them was no good, and so he was forced to turn about and row back to land. He was rather afraid to stay alone in the castle all night, but there was no other house to be got. So he plucked up a hat, locked up all the doors and gates fast, and lay down in a room where there was a bed ready made. But fearful and woeful he was, and still more afraid he got when he had lain a while and something began to creak and groan and quake in wall and roof, as if the whole castle were being torn asunder. Then all at once down something plunged close by the side of his bed, as if it were a whole cartload of hay. Then all was still again, but after a while he heard a voice, which bade him not to be afraid, and said, "Here am I, the big bird Dan, come to help you all I can. But the first thing you must do when you wake in the morning will be to go to the barn and fetch 4 barrels of rye for me. I must fill my crop with them for breakfast, else I can't do anything." When he woke up, sure enough he saw an awfully big bird, which had a feather at the nape of his neck, as thick and long as a half-grown spruce fir. So the king's son went down to the barn to fetch 4 barrels of rye for the big bird Dan, and when he had crammed them into his crop, he told the king's son to hang the press with the gold crowns on one side of his neck, and as much gold and silver as would weigh it down on the other side, and after that to get on his back and hold fast by the feather in the nape of his neck. So away they went till the wind whistled after them, and so it wasn't long before they outstripped the ship. The king's son wanted to go on board for his sword, for he was afraid lest anyone should get sight of it, for the Troll had told him that mustn't be. But Bird Dan said that mustn't be either. Ritter Red will never see it, never fear, but if you go on board he'll try to take your life, for he has set his heart on having the youngest princess. But make your mind quite easy about her, for she lays a naked sword by her side in bed every night." So after a long, long time they came to the island where the Troll Prince was, and there the king's son was welcomed so heartily there was no end to it. The Troll Prince didn't know how to be good enough to him for having slain his lord and master, and so made him king of the Trolls. And if the king's son had been willing, he might easily have got the Troll King's daughter and half the kingdom. But he had so set his heart on the youngest of the 12 princesses, he could take no rest, but was all for going after their ship time after time. So the Troll King begged him to be quiet a little longer, and said they had still nearly 7 years to sail before they got home. As for the princess, the Troll said the same thing as the big bird done. You needn't fret yourself about her, for she lays a naked sword by her side every night in bed. And now, if you don't believe what I say, said the Troll, you can go on board when they sail by here, and see for yourself. And fetch the sword too, for I may just as well have it again. So when they sailed by, another great storm arose, and when the king's son went on board, they all slept, and each princess lay beside her prince. But the youngest lay alone with a naked sword beside her in the bed, and on the floor by the bedside lay Ritter Red. Then the king's son took the sword and rowed ashore again, and none of them had seen that he had been on board. But still, the king's son couldn't rest, and he often and often wanted to be off. And so at last, when they got near the end of the 7 years, and only 3 weeks were left, the Troll King said, Now you may get ready to go, since you won't stay with us, and you shall have the loan of my iron boat, which sails of itself, if you only say, Boat, boat, go on. In that boat there is an iron club, and that club you must lift a little when you see the ship straight ahead of you, and then they'll get such a rattling fair breeze they'll forget to look at you. But when you get alongside them, you must lift the club a little again, and then they'll get such a foul wind and storm they'll have something else to do than to stare at you. And when you have run past them, you must lift the club a third time, but you must always be sure and lay it down carefully again, else there'll be such a storm both you and they will be wrecked and lost. Now when you have got to land, you've no need to bother yourself at all about the boat. Just turn it about and shove it off and say, Boat, boat, go back home. When he set out, they gave him so much gold and silver, and so many other costly things, and clothes and linen, which the Troll Princess had sewn and woven for him all that long time, that he was far richer than any of his brothers. Well, he had no sooner seated himself in the boat and said, Boat, boat, go on, than away went the boat, and when they saw the ship right ahead, he lifted up the club, and then they got such a fair breeze they forgot to look at him. When he was alongside the ship, he lifted the club again, and then such a storm arose and such foul weather that the white foam flew about the ship, and the billows rolled over the deck, and they had something else to do than to stare at him. And when he had run past them, he lifted the club the third time, and the storm and the wind rose so they had still less time to look after him and to make him out. So he came to land long, long before the ship, and when he had got all his goods out of the boat, he shoved it off again, and turned it about and said, Boat, boat, go back home. And off went the boat. Then he dressed himself up as a sailor. Whether the Troll King had told him that, or it was his own device, I'm sure I can't say, and went up to a wretched hut where an old wife lived, whom he got to believe that he was a poor sailor who had been on board a great ship that was wrecked, and that he was the only soul that had got ashore. After that he begged for house room for himself and the goods he had saved. Heaven mend me, said the old wife, how can I lend any one house room? Look at me and mine. Why, I've no bed to sleep on myself, still less one for any one else to lie on. Well, well, it was all the same, said the sailor. If he only got a roof over his head, it didn't matter where he lay. So she couldn't turn him out of the house, when he was so thankful for what there was. That afternoon he fetched up his things, and the old wife, who was very eager to hear a bit of news to run about and tell, began at once to ask who he was, whence he came, whither he was bound, what it was he had with him, what his business was, and if he hadn't heard anything of the 12 princesses who had been away the Lord knew how many years. All this she asked, and much more, which it would be waste of time to tell. But he said he was so poorly, and had such a bad headache after the awful weather he had been out in, that he couldn't answer any of her questions. She must just leave him alone and let him rest a few days till he came to himself after the hard work he'd had in the gale, and then she'd know all she wanted. The very next day the old wife began to stir him up and ask again, but the sailor's head was still so bad he hadn't got his wits together. But somehow he let drop a word or two to show that he did know something about the princesses. Off ran the old wife with what she had heard to all the gossips and chatterboxes round about, and soon the one came running after the other to ask about the princesses, if he had seen them, if they would soon be there, if they were on the way, and much more of the same sort. He still went on groaning over his headache after the storm, so that he couldn't tell them all about it. But so much he told them, unless they had been lost in the great storm, they'd make the land in about a fortnight, or before perhaps. But he couldn't say for sure whether they were alive or no, for though he had seen them, it might very well be that they had been cast away in the storm since. So what did one of these old gossips do but run up to the palace with the story, and say that there was a sailor down in such and such an old wife's hut who had seen the princesses, and that they were coming home in a fortnight or in a week's time. When the king heard that, he sent a messenger down to the sailor to come up to him and tell the news himself. "I don't see how it's to be", said the sailor, "for I haven't any clothes fit to stand in before the king." But the king said he must come, for the king must and would talk with him, whether he were richly or poorly clad, for there was no one else who could bring him any tidings of the princesses. So he went up at last to the palace, and went in before the king, who asked him if it were true that he had seen anything of the princesses. "Ay, ay", said the sailor, "I've seen them sure enough, but I don't know whether they are still alive, for when I last caught sight of them, the weather was so foul, we in our ship were cast away. But if they are still alive, they'll come safe home in a fortnight, or perhaps before." When the king heard that, he was almost beside himself for joy, and when the time came that the sailor had said they would come, the king drove down to the strand to meet them in a great state, and there was joy and gladness over the whole land when the ship came sailing in, with the princes and princesses and Rita Red. But no one was gladder than the old king, who had got his daughters back again. The 11 eldest princesses too were glad and merry, but the youngest, who was to have Rita Red, who said that he had set them all free and slain the troll, she wept and was always sorrowful. The king took this ill, and asked why she wasn't cheerful and merry like the others. She hadn't anything to be sorry for now, when she had got out of the Troll's clutches, and was to have such a husband as Ritter Red. But she daren't say anything, for Ritter Red had said he would take the life of anyone who told the truth how things had gone. But now, one day, when they were hard at work sewing and stitching the bridal array, in came a man in a great sailor's cloak, with a peddler's pack on his back, and asked if the princesses wouldn't buy something fine of him for the wedding. He had so many wares and costly things, both gold and silver. Yes, they might do so perhaps. So they looked at his wares, and they looked at him, for they thought they had seen both him and many of his costly things before. He who has so many fine things, said the youngest princess, must surely have something still more precious, and which suits us better even than these. Maybe I have, said the peddler. But now all the others cried hush, and bade her bear in mind what Ritter Red had said he would do. Well, some time after the princesses sat and looked out of the window, and then the king's son came again with the great sea cloak thrown about him, and the press with the gold crowns at his back. And when he got into the palace hall, he unlocked the press before the princesses, and when each of them knew her own gold crown again, the youngest said, I think it only right that he who set us free should get the meed that is his due, and he is not Ritter Red, but this man who has brought us our gold crowns. He it is that set us free. Then the king's son cast off the sailor's cloak, and stood there far finer and grander than all the rest, and so the old king made him put Ritter Red to death. And now there was real right down joy in the palace. Each took his own bride, and there just was a wedding. Why, it was heard of and talked about over 12 kings' realms. End of section 61.
Section 62 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sharon Riskadal. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 62. Soria, Moria Castle. Once on a time there was a poor couple who had a son whose name was Halvor. Ever since he was a little boy he would turn his hand to nothing, but just sat there and groped about in the ashes. His father and mother often put him out to learn this trade or that, but Halvor could stay nowhere, for when he had been there a day or two he ran away from his master, and never stopped till he was sitting again in the ingle, poking about in the cinders. Well, one day a skipper came and asked Halvor if he hadn't a mind to be with him and go to sea and see strange lands. Yes, Halvor would like that very much, so he wasn't long in getting himself ready. How long they sailed I'm sure I can't tell, but the end of it was they fell into a great storm, and when it was blown over and it got still again, they couldn't tell where they were, for they had been driven away to a strange coast which none of them knew anything about. Well, as there was just no wind at all, they stayed lying wind-bound there, and Halvor asked the skipper's leave to go on shore and look about him. He would sooner go, he said, than lie there and sleep. "Do you think now you're fit to show yourself before folks?" said the skipper. "Why, you've no clothes but those rags you stand in." But Halvor stuck to his own, and so at last he got leave, but he was to be sure and come back as soon as ever it began to blow. So off he went and found a lovely land. Wherever he came there were fine, large, flat cornfields and rich meads, but he couldn't catch a glimpse of a living soul. Well, it began to blow, but Halvor thought he hadn't seen enough yet, and he wanted to walk a little farther, just to see if he couldn't meet any folk. So after a while he came to a broad high road, so smooth and even you might easily roll an egg along it. Halvor followed this, and when evening drew on he saw a great castle ever so far off, from which the sunbeams shone. So as he had now walked the whole day, and hadn't taken a bit to eat with him, he was as hungry as a hunter, but still the nearer he came to the castle, the more afraid he got. In the castle kitchen a great fire was blazing, and Halvor went into it, but such a kitchen he had never seen in all his born days. It was so grand and fine, there were vessels of silver and vessels of gold, but still never a living soul. So when Halvor had stood there a while and no one came out, he went and opened a door, and there inside sat a princess, who span upon a spinning wheel. "Nay, nay, now", she called out, "dare Christian folk come hither? But now you'd best be off about your business, if you don't want the Troll to gobble you up, for here lives a Troll with 3 heads." "All one to me", said the lad. "I'd be just as glad to hear he had 4 heads besides. I'd like to see what kind of a fellow he is. As for going, I won't go at all. I've done no harm, but meat you must get me, for I'm almost starved to death." When Halvor had eaten his fill, the Princess told him to try if he could brandish the sword that hung against the wall. No, he couldn't brandish it, he couldn't even lift it up. "Oh", said the Princess, "now you must go and take a pull of that flask that hangs by its side. That's what the Troll does every time he goes out to use the sword." So Halvor took a pull, and in the twinkling of an eye he could brandish the sword like nothing, and now he thought it high time the Troll came. And lo! just then up came the Troll, puffing and blowing. Halvor jumped behind the door. "Hoot-too", said the Troll, as he put his head in at the door. "What a smell of Christian man's blood!" "Ay", said Halvor, "you'll soon know that to your cost", and with that he hewed off all his heads. Now the Princess was so glad that she was free, she both danced and sang. But then all at once she called her sisters to mind, and so she said, "Would my sisters were free too." "Where are they?" asked Halvor. Well, she told him all about it. One was taken away by a Troll to his castle, which lay 50 miles off, and the other by another Troll to his castle, which was 50 miles further still. "But now", she said, "you must first help me to get this ugly carcass out of the house." Yes, Halvor was so strong, he swept everything away and made it all clean and tidy in no time. So they had a good and happy time of it, and the next morning he set off at peep of grey dawn. He could take no rest by the way, but ran and walked the whole day. When he first saw the castle, he got a little afraid. It was far grander than the first, but here too there wasn't a living soul to be seen. So Halvor went into the kitchen, and didn't stop there either, but went straight further on into the house. "Nay, nay", called out the Princess, "dare Christian folk come hither? I don't know, I'm sure, how long it is since I came here, but in all that time I haven't seen a Christian man. 'Twere best you saw how to get away as fast as you came, for here lives a Troll who has 6 heads. "I shan't go", said Halvor, "if he has 6 heads besides." "He'll take you up and swallow you down alive", said the Princess. But it was no good. Halvor wouldn't go. He wasn't at all afraid of the Troll, but meat and drink he must have, for he was half starved after his long journey. Well, he got as much of that as he wished, but then the Princess wanted him to be off again. "No", said Halvor, "I won't go. I've done no harm, and I've nothing to be afraid about." "He won't stay to ask that", said the Princess, "for he'll take you without law or leave. But as you won't go, just try if you can brandish that sword yonder, which the Troll wields in war." He couldn't brandish it, and then the Princess said he must take a pull at the flask which hung by its side, and when he had done that he could brandish it. Just then back came the Troll, and he was both stout and big, so that he had to go sideways to get through the door. When the Troll got his first head in, he called out, "Hoo-too! What a smell of Christian man's blood!" But that very moment Halvor hewed off his first head, and so on, all the rest as they popped in. The Princess was overjoyed, but just then she came to think of her sisters, and wished out loud they were free. Halvor thought that might easily be done, and wanted to be off at once, but first he had to help the Princess to get the Troll's carcass out of the way, and so he could only set out the next morning. It was a long way to the castle, and he had to walk fast and run hard to reach it in time. But about nightfall he saw the castle, which was far finer and grander than either of the others. This time he wasn't the least afraid, but walked straight through the kitchen and into the castle. There sat a Princess who was so pretty there was no end to her loveliness. She too, like the others, told him there hadn't been Christian folk there ever since she came thither, and bade him go away again, else the Troll would swallow him alive. "And do you know", she said, "he has 9 heads." "Aye, aye", said Halvor, "if he had 9 other heads, and 9 other heads still, I won't go away." And so he stood fast before the stove. The Princess kept on begging him so prettily to go away, lest the Troll should gobble him up, but Halvor said, "Let him come as soon as he likes." So she gave him the Troll's sword, and bade him take a pull at the flask, that he might be able to brandish and wield it. Just then back came the Troll, puffing and blowing and tearing along. He was far stouter and bigger than the other two, and he too had to go on one side to get through the door. So when he got his first head in, he said, as the others had said, "Hoo-too! What a smell of Christian man's blood!" That very moment Halvor hewed off the first head, and then all the rest, but the last was the toughest of them all, and it was the hardest bit of work Halvor had to do to get it hewn off, although he knew very well he had strength enough to do it. So all the princesses came together to that castle, which was called Soria Moria Castle, and they were glad and happy as they had never been in all their lives before, and they were all fond of Halvor, and Halvor of them, and he might choose the one he liked best for his bride, but the youngest was fondest of him of all the 3. But there after a while Halvor went about, and was so strange and dull and silent. Then the princesses asked him what he lacked, and if he didn't like to live with them any longer. Yes, he did, for they had enough and to spare, and he was well off in every way, but still, somehow or other, he did so long to go home, for his father and mother were alive, and them he had such a great wish to see. Well, they thought that might be done easily enough. "You shall go thither and come back hither, safe and unscathed, if you will only follow our advice", said the princesses. Yes, he'd be sure to mind all they said. So they dressed him up till he was as grand as a king's son, and then they set a ring on his finger, and that was such a ring he could wish himself thither and hither with it. But they told him to be sure not to take it off, and not to name their names, for there would be an end of all his bravery, and then he'd never see them more. "If I only stood at home I'd be glad", said Halvor, and it was done as he wished. Then stood Halvor at his father's cottage door before he knew a word about it. Now it was about dusk at even, and so, when they saw such a grand stately lord walk in, the old couple got so afraid they began to bow and scrape. Then Halvor asked if he couldn't stay there and have a lodging there that night. No, that he couldn't. "We can't do it at all", they said, "for we haven't this thing or that thing which such a lord is used to have. 'Twere best your lordship went up to the farm, no long way off, for you can see the chimneys, and there they have lots of everything." Halvor wouldn't hear of it. He wanted to stop, but the old couple stuck to their own that he had better go to the farmer's. There he would get both meat and drink. As for them, they hadn't even a chair to offer him to sit down on. "No", said Halvor, "I won't go up there till tomorrow morning early, but let the just stay here tonight. Worst come to the worst, I can sit in the chimney corner." Well, they couldn't say anything against that, so Halvor sat down by the ingle and began to poke about in the ashes, just as he used to do when he lay at home in the old days and stretched his lazy bones. Well, they chattered and talked about many things, and they told Halvor about this thing and that, and so he asked them if they had never had any children. Yes, yes, they once had a lad whose name was Halvor, but they didn't know whether he had wandered. They couldn't even tell whether he were dead or alive. "Couldn't it be me now?" said Halvor. "Let me see. I could tell him well enough", said the old wife, and rose up. "Our Halvor was so lazy and dull, he never did a thing, and besides he was so ragged that one tatter took hold of the next tatter on him. No, there never was the making of such a fine fellow in him as you are, master." A little while after the old wife went to the hearth to poke up the fire, and when the blaze fell on Halvor's face, just as when he was at home of old, poking about in the ashes, she knew him at once. "Ah, but is it you after all, Halvor?" she cried, and then there was such joy for the old couple, there was no end to it, and he was forced to tell how he had fared, and the old dame was so fond and proud of him, nothing would do but he must go up at once to the farmer's and show himself to the lassies, who had always looked down on him. And off she went first, and Halvor followed after. So when she got up there, she told them all how her Halvor had come home again, and now they should only just see how grand he was. "For", said she, "he looks like nothing but a king's son." "All very fine", said the lassies, and tossed up their heads. "We'll be bound he's just the same beggarly ragged boy he always was." Just then in walked Halvor, and then the lassies were all so taken aback they forgot their sarks in the ingle where they were sitting darning their clothes, and ran out in their smocks. Well, when they were back again, they were so shamefaced they scarce dared look at Halvor, towards whom they had always been so proud and haughty. "Aye, aye", said Halvor, "you always thought yourselves so pretty and neat, no one could come near you. But now you should just see the eldest princess I have set free. Against her you look just like milkmaids, and the midmost is prettier still. But the youngest, who is my sweetheart, she's fairer than both sun and moon. Would to heaven she were only here", said Halvor, "then you'd see what you would see." He had scarce uttered these words before there they stood, but then he felt so sorry, for now what they had said came into his mind. Up at the farm there was a great feast got ready for the princesses, and much was made of them, But they wouldn't stop there. "No, we want to go down to your father and mother", they said to Halvor, "and so we'll go out now and look about us." So he went down with them, and they came to a great lake just outside the farm. Close by the water was such a lovely green bank. Here the Princesses said they would sit and rest a while. They thought it so sweet to sit down and look over the water. So they sat down, and when they had sat a while, the youngest Princess said, "I may as well comb your hair a little, Halvor." Yes, Halvor laid his head on her lap, and so she combed his bonny locks, and it wasn't long before Halvor fell fast asleep. Then she took the ring from his finger and put another in its stead, and so she said, "Now hold me all together, and now would we were all in Soria Moria Castle." So when Halvor woke up, he could very well tell that he had lost the Princesses, and began to weep and wail, and he was so downcast they couldn't comfort him at all. In spite of all his father and mother said, he wouldn't stop there, but took farewell of them, and said he was safe not to see them again, for if he couldn't find the Princesses again, he thought it not worth while to live. Well, he still had $300 left, so he put them into his pocket and set out on his way. So when he had walked a while, he met a man with a tidy horse, and he wanted to buy it, and began to chaffer with the man. "I", said the man, "to tell the truth, I never thought of selling him, but if we could strike a bargain, perhaps—" "What do you want for him?" asked Halvor. "I didn't give much for him, nor is he worth much. He's a brave horse to ride, but he can't draw at all. Still he's strong enough to carry your knapsack, and you too, turn and turn about", said the man. At last they agreed on the price, and Halvor laid the knapsack on him, and so he walked a bit and rode a bit, turn and turn about. At night he came to a green plain where stood a great tree, at the roots of which he sat down. There he let the horse loose, but he didn't lie down to sleep, but opened his knapsack and took a meal. At peep of day off he set again, for he could take no rest. So he rode and walked and rode the whole day through the wide wood, where there were so many green spots and glades that shone so bright and lovely between the trees. He didn't know at all where he was or whither he was going, but he gave himself no more time to rest than when his horse cropped a bit of grass, and he took a snack out of his knapsack when they came to one of those green glades. So he went on walking and riding by turns, and as for the wood, there seemed to be no end to it. But at dusk the next day he saw a light gleaming away through the trees. "Would there were folk hereaway", thought Halvor, "that I might warm myself a bit, and get a morsel to keep my body and soul together." When he got up to it, he saw the light came from a wretched little hut, and through the window he saw an old couple inside. They were as grey-headed as a pair of doves, and the old wife had such a nose, why, it was so long, she used it for a poker to stir the fire as she sat in the ingle. "Good evening", said Halvor. "Good evening", said the old wife. "But what errand can you have in coming thither?" she went on, "for no Christian folk have been here these 100 years or more." Well, Halvor told him all about himself, and how he wanted to get to Soria Moria Castle, and asked if she knew the way thither. "No", said the wife, "that I don't, but see now, here comes the moon. I'll ask her, she'll know all about it, for doesn't she shine on everything?" So when the moon stood clear and bright over the tree tops, the old wife went out. thou moon", she screamed, "canst thou tell me the way to Soria Moria Castle?" "No", said the moon, "that I can't, for the last time I shone there a cloud stood before me." "Wait a bit still", said the old wife to Halvor, "by and by comes the west wind. He's sure to know, for he puffs and blows around every corner." "Nay, nay", said the old wife when she went out again, "you don't mean to say you've got a horse too? Just turn the poor beastie loose in our town, and don't let him stand there and starve to death at the door." Then she ran on, "But won't you swap him away to me? We've got an old pair of boots here, with which you can take 20 miles at each stride. Those you shall have for your horse, and so you'll get all the sooner to Soria Moria Castle." That Halvor was willing to do at once, and the old wife was so glad at having the horse, she was ready to dance and skip for joy. "For now", she said, "I shall be able to ride to church. I too think of that." As for Halvor, he had no rest and wanted to be off at once, but the old wife said there was no hurry. "Lie down on the bench with you and sleep a bit, for we've no bed to offer you, and I'll watch and wake you when the west wind comes." So after a while up came the west wind, roaring and howling along, till the walls creaked and groaned again. Out ran the old wife. "Thou west wind, canst thou tell me the way to Soria Moria Castle? Here's one who wants to get thither." "Yes, I know it very well", said the west wind, "and now I'm just off thither to dry clothes for the wedding that's to be. If he's swift of foot he can go along with me." Out ran Halvor. "You'll have to stretch your legs if you mean to keep up", said the west wind. So off he set over field and hedge and hill and fell, and Halvor had hard work to keep up. "Well", said the west wind, "now I've no time to stay with you any longer, for I've got to go away yonder and tear down a strip of spruce wood first, before I go to the bleaching ground to dry the clothes. But if you go alongside the hill, you'll come to a lot of lassies standing washing clothes, and then you've not far to go to Soria Moria Castle." In a little while Halvor came upon the lassies, who stood washing, and they asked if he had seen anything of the west wind who was to come and dry the clothes for the wedding. "Aye, that I have", said Halvor. "He's only gone to tear down a strip of spruce wood. It'll not be long before he's here." And then he asked them the way to Soria Moria Castle. So they put him on the right way, and when he got to the castle it was full of folk and horses, so full it made one giddy to look at them. But Halvor was so ragged and torn from having followed the west wind through brush and briar and bog, that he kept on one side and wouldn't show himself till the last day when the bridal feast was to be. So when all, as was then right and fitting, were to drink the bride and bridegroom's health and wish them luck, and when the cupbearer was to drink to them all again, both knights and squires, last of all he came in turn to Halvor. He drank their health, but let the ring which the Princess had put upon his finger as he lay by the lake fall into the glass, and bade the cupbearer go and greet the bride and hand her the glass. Then up rose the Princess from the board at once. "Who is most worthy to have one of us?" she said. "He that has set us free, or he that here sits by me as bridegroom?" Well, they all said there could be but one voice and will as to that, and when Halvor heard that, he wasn't long in throwing off his beggar's rags and arraying himself as bridegroom. "Aye, here is the right one after all", said the youngest Princess as soon as she saw him, and so she tossed the other one out of the window and held her wedding with Halvor. End of section 62.
Section 63 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Didier. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 63. Bruin and Reinhard. The bear and the fox had once bought a firkin of butter together. They were to have it at Yule, and hid it till then, under a thick spruce bush. After that, they went a little way off and lay down on a sunny bank to sleep. So when they had lain a while, the fox got up, shook himself, and bawled out, "Yes!" Then he ran off straight to the firkin and ate a good third part of it. But when he came back, and the bear asked him where he had been since he was so fat about a pound, he said, "Don't you believe, then, that I was bidden to Basel to a christening feast?" "So, said the bear. "And pray, what was the bairn's name?" "Just began," said the fox. So they lay down to sleep again. In a little while up jumped the fox again, bawled out, "Yes!" and ran off to the firkin. This time, too, he ate a good lump. When he came back, and the bear asked him again where he had been, he said, "Oh, wasn't I bidden to Basel again, don't you think?" "And pray, what was the bairn's name this time?" asked the bear. "Half eaten," said the fox. The bear thought that a very queer name, but he hadn't wondered long over it before he began to yawn and gape and fell asleep. Well, he hadn't lain long before the fox jumped up, as he had done twice before, bawled out, "Yes!" and ran off to the firkin, which this time he cleared right out. When he got back, he had been bidden to Basel again, and when the bear wanted to know the bairn's name, he answered, "Licked to the bottom." After that, they lay down again and slept a long time. But then they were to go to the firkin to look at the butter, and when they found it eaten up, the bear threw the blame on the fox, and the fox on the bear, and each said the one had been at the firkin while the other slept. "Well, well," said Reinhard, "we'll soon find this out, which of us has eaten the butter. We'll just lay down in the sunshine, and he whose cheeks and chaps are greasiest when we wake is the thief." Yes, that trial Bruin was ready to stand, and as he knew in his heart he had never so much as tasted the butter, he lay down without a care to sleep in the sun. Then Reinhard stole off to the firkin for a morsel of butter, which stuck there in a crack, and then he crept back to the bear and greased his chaps and cheeks with it, and then he, too, lay down to sleep as if nothing had happened. So when they both woke, the sun had melted the butter, and the bear's whiskers were all greasy. So it was Bruin, after all, no one else, who had eaten the butter. End of section 63. And 64 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Didier. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 64, Tom Totherhouse. Once on a time there was a goody who had a deaf husband. A good, easy man he was, but that was just why she thought more of the lad next door, whom they called Tom Totherhouse. Now the lad that served the deaf man saw very well that the two had something between them, and one day he said to the goody, "Dare you wager $10, mother, that I don't make you lay bare your own shame?" "Yes, I dare," said she, and so they wagered $10. So one day, while the lad and the deaf man stood threshing in the barn, the lad saw that Tom Totherhouse came to see the goody. He said nothing, but a good while before dinner time he turned toward the barn door and bawled out, "Halloa!" "What, are we to go home already?" said the man, who hadn't given any heed to what the lad did. "Yes, we must, since mother calls," said the lad. So when they got into the passage, the lad began to hem and cough that the goody might get Tom Totherhouse out of the way. But when they came into the room, there stood a whole bowl of custards on the table. "Nay, nay, mother," cried out the man, "shall we have custards today?" "Yes, that you shall, dear," said the goody, but she was as sour as verjuice, and as cross as 2 sticks. So when they had eaten and drunk all the good cheer up, off they went again to their work, and the goody said to Tom, "Deil take that lad's sharp nose, this was all his fault. But now you must be off as fast as you can, and I'll come down to you in the mead with a snack between meals." This the lad stood outside in the passage and listened to. "Do you know, father," he said, "I think we'd best go down into the hollow and put our fence to rights, which is blown down, before the neighbours' swine get in and root up our meadow." "Aye, aye, let's go and do it," said the man, for he did all he was told, good easy man. So when the afternoon was half spent, down came the goody, sneaking along into the mead, with something under her apron. "Nay, nay, mother," said the man, "it can't be you any longer. Are we to have a snack between meals too?" "Yes, yes, that you shall," she said, but she was sourer and wilder than ever. So they made merry and crammed themselves with bannocks and butter, and had a drop of brandy into the bargain. "I'll go off to Tom Totherhouse with a snack, shan't I, mother?" said the lad. "He's had nothing between meals, I'll be bound." "Ah, do, there's a good fellow," said the goody, who all at once got as mild as milk. As he went along, the lad broke a bannock to bits, and dropped the crumbs here and there as he walked. But when he got to Tom Totherhouse, he said, "Now you just take care, for our old cock has found out that you come too often to see our goody. He won't stand it any longer, and he has sworn to drive his axe into you as soon as ever he can set eyes on you." As for Tom, he was so frightened, he scarce knew which way to turn, and the lad went back again to his master. "There's something wrong," he said, "with Tom's plough, and he begs you to be so good as to take your axe and go and see if you can't set it right." Yes, the man set off with his axe, but Tom Totherhouse had scarce caught sight of him before he took to his heels as fast as he could. The man turned and twisted the plough round and round, and looked at it on every side, and when he couldn't see anything wrong with it, he went off home again. But on the way he picked up the bits of broken bannock which the lad had left fall. His old dame stood in the meadow, and looked at him as he did this for a while, and wondered what it could be her husband was gathering up. "Oh, I know," said the lad, Master's picking up stones, I'll be bound, for he has marked how often this Tom Totherhouse runs over here, and the old fellow won't stand it any longer, and now he has sworn to stone mother to death. Off went the goody as fast as her legs could carry her. What in the world is it that mother is running after now? Asked the man, when he reached the spot where she had stood. Oh, said the lad, maybe the house at home is on fire. So there ran the husband behind and the goody before, and as she ran she screeched out, Ah, don't stone me to death, don't stone me to death, and I'll give you my word never to let Tom Totherhouse come near me again. Now the $10 are mine, bawled out the lad, and so they were. End of section 64.
Of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kalinda. Popular Tales from the North by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 65. Little Annie the Goose Girl. Once on a time there was a king who had so many geese he was forced to have a lassie to tend them and watch them. Her name was Annie, and so they called her Annie the Goose Girl. Now you must know there was a king's son from England who went out to woo, and as he came along Anne sat herself down in his way. "Sitting all alone there, you little Annie?" said the king's son. "Yes," said little Annie. "Here I sit, and put stitch to stitch and patch on patch. I'm waiting to-day for the king's son from England." "Him you mustn't look to have," said the Prince. "Nay, but if I'm to have him," said little Annie, "have him I shall, after all." And now limners were sent out into all lands and realms to take the likenesses of the fairest princesses, and the Prince was to choose between them. So he thought so much of one of them that he set out to seek her, and wanted to wed her, and he was glad and happy when he got her for his sweetheart. But now I must tell you, this Prince had a stone with him, which he laid by his bedside, and that stone knew everything. And when the Princess came, little Annie told her, if so be she'd had a sweetheart before, or didn't feel herself quite free from anything which she didn't wish the Prince to know, she'd better not step on that stone which lay by the bedside. "If you do, it will tell him all about you," said little Annie. So when the Princess heard that, she was dreadfully downcast, and fell upon the thought to ask Annie if she would get into bed that night in her stead, and lie down by the Prince's side, and then, when he was sound asleep, Annie should get out, and the Princess should get in, and so when he woke up in the morning he would find the right bride by his side. So they did that, and when Annie the Goose Girl came and stepped upon the stone, the Prince asked, "Who is this that steps into my bed?" "A maid pure and bright," said the stone, and so they lay down to sleep. But when the night wore on, the Princess came and lay down in Annie's stead. But next morning, when they were to get up, the Prince asked the stone again, "Who is this that steps out of my bed?" "One that has had 3 bairns," said the stone. When the Prince heard that, he wouldn't have her, you may know very well, and so he packed her off home again, and took another sweetheart. But as he went to see her, little Annie went and sat down in his way again. "Sitting all alone there, little Annie the Goose Girl?" said the Prince. "Yes, here I sit, and put stitch to stitch, and patch on patch, for I'm waiting to-day for the king's son from England," said Annie. "Oh, you mustn't look to have him," said the king's son. "Nay, but if I'm to have him I shall, after all." That was what Annie thought. Well, it was the same story over again with the Prince, only this time, when his bride got up in the morning, the stone said she'd had 6 bairns. So the Prince wouldn't have her either, but sent her about her business. But still he thought he'd try once more if he couldn't find one who was pure and spotless, and he sought far and wide in many lands, till at last he found one he thought he might trust. But when he went to see her, little Annie the goose girl had put herself in his way again. "Sitting all alone there, you little Annie the goose girl", said the Prince. "Yes, here I sit, and put stitch to stitch, and patch on patch, for I'm waiting to-day for the King's son from England", said Annie. "Him you mustn't look to have", said the Prince. "Nay, but if I'm to have him I shall, after all", said little Annie. So, when the Princess came, little Annie the goose girl told her the same as she had told the other two. If she'd had any sweetheart before, or if there was anything else she didn't wish the Prince to know, she mustn't tread on the stone that the Prince had put at his bedside, for, said she, it tells him everything. The Princess got very red and downcast when she heard that, for she was just as naughty as the others, and asked Annie if she would go in her stead and lie down with the Prince that night, and when he was sound asleep she would come and take her place, and then he would have the right bride by his side when it was light next morning. Yes, they did that, and when little Annie the goose girl came and stepped upon the stone, the Prince asked, "Who is this that steps into my bed?" "A maid pure and bright", said the stone, and so they lay down to rest. Farther on in the night the Prince put a ring on Annie's finger, and it fitted so tight she couldn't get it off again, for the Prince saw well enough there was something wrong, and so he wished to have a mark by which he might know the right woman again. Well, when the Prince had gone off to sleep, the Princess came and drove Annie away to the pigsty, and lay down in her place. Next morning, when they were to get up, the Prince asked, "Who is this that steps out of my bed?" "One that's had 9 barns", said the stone. When the Prince heard that, he drove her away at once, for he was in an awful rage, and then he asked the stone how it all was with these princesses who had stepped on it, for he couldn't understand it at all, he said. So the stone told him how they had cheated him, and sent little Annie the goose girl to him in their stead. But as the Prince wished to have no mistake about it, he went down to her where she sat tending her geese, for he wanted to see if she had the ring too, and he thought, if she has it, 'twere best to take her at once for my queen. So when he got down he saw in a moment that she had tied a bit of rag round one of her fingers, and so he asked her why it was tied up. "Oh, I've cut myself so badly", said little Annie the goose girl. So he must and would see the finger, but Annie wouldn't take the rag off. Then he caught hold of the finger, but Annie she tried to pull it from him, and so between them the rag came off, and then he knew his ring. So he took her up to the palace, and gave her much fine clothes and attire, and after that they held their wedding feast, and so little Annie the goose girl came to have the King of England's son for her husband after all, just because it was written that she should have him. End of section 65.
Section 66 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Didier. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 66. Introduction to Appendix. Anansi Stories. The Negroes in the West Indies still retain the tales and traditions which their fathers and grandfathers brought with them from Africa. Some 30 years back, these Anansi stories, as they are called, were invariably told at the Negro wakes, which lasted for 9 successive nights. The reciters were always men. In those days, when the slaves were still half heathen, and when the awful obeah was universally believed in, such of the Negroes as attended church or chapel kept their children away from these funeral gatherings. The wakes are now, it is believed, almost entirely discontinued, and with them have gone the stories. The Negroes are very shy of telling them, and both the clergyman of the Church of England and the dissenting minister set their faces against them and called them foolishness. The translator, whose early childhood was passed in those islands, remembers to have heard such stories from his nurse, who was an African born. But beyond a stray fragment here and there, the rich store which she possessed has altogether escaped his memory. The following stories have been taken down from the mouth of a West Indian nurse in his sister's house, who, born and bred in it, is rather regarded as a member of the family than as a servant. They are printed just as she told them, and both their genuineness and their affinity with the stories of other races will be self-evident. Thus, we have the wishing tree of the Hindus, the Kalpavriksha of Somadeva, and the German fairy tales in the pumpkin tree, which throws down as many pumpkins as the poor widow wishes. In one story, we have Boots to the life, while the man whom he outwits is own brother to the Norse trolls. In another, we find a speaking beast, which reminds us at once of the Egyptian story of Anesu and Satu, as well as of the Machandal boom and the milky white dew. We find here the woman who washes the dirty head rewarded, and the man who refuses to wash it punished, in the very words used in The Bushy Bride. We find too in Nancy Ferry the same story, both in groundwork and incident, as we have in The Lassie and Her Godmother. And most surprising of all, in the story of Anansi and Quan, we found the very trait about a trick played with the tail of an ox, which is met within a variation to Boots who ate a match with a troll. Here is the variation. Whilst he was with the troll, the lad was to go out to watch the swine, so he drove them home to his father's house, but first he cut their tails off and stuck them into the ground. Then he went home to the troll and begged him to come and see how his swine were going down to hell. But when the troll saw the swine's tails sticking out of the ground, he wanted to pull them back again, so he caught hold of them and gave a great tug, and then down he fell with his heels up in the air and the tails in his fist. They are called Anansi stories because so many of them turn on the fist of Anansi, whose character is a mixture of the master thief and of Boots. But the most curious thing about him is that he illustrates the beast epic in a remarkable way. In all the West Indian islands, Anansi is the name of spiders in general, and of a very beautiful spider with yellow stripes in particular. Footnote: compare Crowther's Yoruba glossary, where Alansasa is given as the Yoruban for spider. The change of N into L is not uncommon, even supposing the West Indian word to be uncorrupt. End of footnote. The Negroes think that this spider is the Anansi of their stories, but that his superior cunning enables him to take any shape he pleases. In fact, he is the example which the African tribes from which these stories came have chosen to take as pointing out the superiority of wit over brute strength. In this way, they have matched the cleverness and dexterity of the spider against the bone and the muscle of the lion, invariably to the disadvantage of the latter. After this introduction, we let the tales speak for themselves, only premising that the Jack Spaniard in the first story is a very pretty fly of the wasp kind, and like his European brother, very small in the West. That the cash is a little red yam, which imparts a strong red dye to everything with which it is boiled. and that the ducana is a forest tree which bears a fruit, though of what kind it is hard to say. End of section 66. '67 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Didier. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 67. Why the Jack Spaniard's waist is small. Anansi and Mosquito were talking together one day and boasting of their father's crops. Anansi said his father had never had such a crop in his life before, and Mosquito said he was sure his father's was bigger, for one yam they dug was as big as his leg. This tickled Jack Spaniard so much that he laughed till he broke his waist in two. That's why the Jack Spaniard's waist is so small. End of section 67.
'68 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lucy Perry. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 68. Anansi and the Lion. Once on a time Anansi planned a scheme. He went to town and bought ever so many firkins of fat, and ever so many sacks, and ever so many balls of string, and a very big frying pan. Then he went to the bay and blew a shell, and called the head fish in the sea, Green Eel, to him. Then he said to the fish, "The king sends me to tell you that you must bring all the fish on the shore, for he wants to give them new life." So Green Eel said he would, and went to call them. Meanwhile Anansi lighted a fire, and took out some of the fat, and got his frying pan ready, and as fast as the fish came out of the water, he caught them and put them into the frying pan, and so he did with all of them, until he got to the head fish, who was so slippery that he couldn't hold him, and he got back again into the water. When Anansi had fried all the fish, he put them into the sacks, and took the sacks on his back, and set off to the mountains. He had not gone very far when he met Lion, and Lion said to him, "Well, brother Anansi, where have you been? I have not seen you a long time." Anansi said, "I have been travelling about." "But what have you got there?" said the Lion. "Oh, I have got my mother's bones. She has been dead these 11 years, and they say I must not keep her here, so I am taking her up to the middle of the mountains to bury her." Then they parted. After he had gone a little way, the Lion said, "I know that Anansi is a great rogue. I dare say he has got something there that he doesn't want me to see, and I will just follow him." But he took care not to let Anansi see him. Now when Anansi got into the wood, he set his sacks down, and took one fish out, and began to eat. Then a fly came, and Anansi said, "I cannot eat any more, for there is someone near." So he tied the sack up, and went on further into the mountains, where he set his sacks down, and took out 2 fish, which he ate, and no fly came. He said, "There's no one near." So he took out more fish. But when he had eaten about 1/2 dozen, the Lion came up and said, "Well, brother Anansi, a pretty tale you have told me." "Oh, brother Lion, I am so glad you have come. Never mind what tale I have told you, but come and sit down, it was only my fun." So the Lion sat down and began to eat. But before Anansi had eaten 2 fish, Lion had emptied one of the sacks. Then Anansi said to himself, "Greedy fellow, eating up all my fish." "What do you say, sir?" "I only said you do not eat half fast enough," for he was afraid the Lion would eat him up. Then they went on eating, but Anansi wanted to revenge himself, and he said to the Lion, "Which of us do you think is the strongest?" The Lion said, "Why, I am, of course." Then Anansi said, We will tie one another to the tree, and we shall see which is the stronger." Now they agreed that the lion should tie Anansi first, and he tied him with some very fine string, and did not tie him tight. Anansi twisted himself about 2 or 3 times, and the string broke. Then it was Anansi's turn to tie the lion, and he took some very strong cord. The lion said, "You must not tie me tight, for I did not tie you tight." And Anansi said, "Oh no, to be sure I will not." But he tied him as tight as ever he could, and then told him to try and get loose. The lion tried and tried in vain. He could not get loose. Then Anansi thought, "Now is my chance." So he got a big stick and beat him, and then went away and left him, for he was afraid to loose him lest he should kill him. Now there was a woman called Miss Nancy who was going out one morning to get some callaloo spinach in the wood, and as she was going she heard someone say, "Good morning, Miss Nancy." She could not tell who spoke to her, but she looked where the voice came from and saw the lion tied to the tree. "Good morning, Mr. Lion. What are you doing there?" He said, "It is all that fellow Anansi who has tied me to the tree, but will you loose me?" But she said, "No, for I am afraid if I do you will kill me." But he gave her his word he would not. Still she could not trust him, but he begged her again and again, and said, "Well, if I do try to eat you, I hope all the trees will cry out shame upon me." So at last she consented, but she had no sooner loosed him than he came up to her to eat her, for he had been so many days without food that he was quite ravenous. But the trees immediately cried out, "Shame!" and so he could not eat her. Then she went away as fast as she could, and the lion found his way home. When the lion got home he told his wife and children all that had happened to him, and how Miss Nancy had saved his life. So they said they would have a great dinner, and ask Miss Nancy. Now when Anansi heard of it, he wanted to go to the dinner, so he went to Miss Nancy and said she must take him with her as her child, but she said no. Then he said, "I can make myself into quite a little child, and then you can take me," and at last she said, "Yes." And he told her, when she was asked what pap her baby ate, she must be sure to tell them it did not eat pap, but the same food as everyone else, and so they went and had a very good dinner and set off home again. But somehow one of the lion's sons fancied that all was not right, and he told his father he was sure it was Anansi, and the lion set out after him. Now as they were going along, before the lion got up to them, Anansi begged Miss Nancy to put him down that he might run, which she did, and he got away and ran along the wood, and the lion ran after him. When he found the lion was overtaking him, he turned himself into an old man with a bundle of wood on his head. And when the lion got up to him, he said, "Good morning, Mr. Lion." And the lion said, "Good morning, old gentleman." Then the old man said, "What are you after now?" And the lion asked if he had seen Anansi pass that way, but the old man said, "No, that fellow Anansi is always meddling with someone. What mischief has he been up to now?" Then the lion told him, but the old man said it was no use to follow him any more, for he would never catch him, and so the lion wished him good day, and turned and went home again. End of section 68. Recording by Lucy Perry, in Bath, on April 16th, 2009.
'69 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by George Yeager. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 69. Anansi and Quan. Quan was a very clever fellow, and he had a large house full of all sorts of meat. But you must know he had a way of saying Quan, qua, how, what, when anyone asked him anything, so they called him Quan. One day when he was out, he met Atukkama, Anansi's wife, who was going along driving an ox, but the ox would not walk, so Atukkama asked Quan to help her, and they got on pretty well till they came to a river, when the ox would not cross through the water. Then Atukkama called to Quan to drive the ox across, but all she could get out of him was Quan, qua, Quan, qua. At last she said, "Oh, you stupid fellow, you're no good. Stop here and mind the ox while I go and get help to drive him across." So off she went to fetch Anansi. As soon as Atoukama was gone away, Quan killed the ox and hid it all away, where Anansi should not see it. But first he cut off the tail, then he dug a hole near the riverside and stuck the tail partly in, leaving out the tip. When he saw Anansi coming, he caught hold of the tail, pretending to tug at it as if he were pulling the ox out of the hole. Anansi, seeing this, ran up as fast as he could, and tugging at the tail with all his might, fell over into the river. But he still had hold of the tail, and contrived to get across the water, when he called out to Quan, "You idle fellow, you couldn't take care of the ox, so you shan't have a bit of the tail," and then on he went. When he was gone quite out of sight, Quan took the ox home, and made a very good dinner. Next day he went to Anansi's house, and said Anansi must give him some of the tail, for he had got plenty of yams, but he had no meat. Then they agreed to cook their pot together. Quan was to put in white yams, and Anansi the tail, and red yams. When they came to put the yams in, Quan put in a great many white yams, but Anansi only put in one little red cush yam. Quan asked him if that little yam would be enough. He said, "Oh, plenty, for I don't eat much." When the pot boiled, they uncovered it, and sat down to eat their shares. But they couldn't find any white yams at all. The little red one had turned them all red. So Anansi claimed them all, and Quan was glad to take what Anansi would give him. Now when they had done eating, they said they would try which could bear heat best. So they heated 2 irons, and Anansi was to try first on Quan, but he made so many attempts that the iron got cold before he got near him. Then it was Quan's turn, and he pulled the iron out of the fire and poked it right down Anansi's throat. End of section 69.
Of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Vinny. Popular Tales from the Norse by George Dasent. Section 70. The Ear of Corn and the 12 Men. Anansi said to the king that if he would give him an ear of corn, he would bring him 12 strong men. The king gave him the ear of corn, and he went away. At last he got to a house, where he asked for a night's lodging, which was given him. The next morning he got up very early, and threw the ear of corn out of the door to the fowls, and went back to bed. When he got up in the morning, he looked for his ear of corn, and could not find it anywhere, so he told them he was sure the fowls had eaten it, and he would not be satisfied unless they gave him the best cock they had. So they were obliged to give him the cock, and he went away with it all day, until night, when he came to another house, and asked again for a night's lodging, which he got. But when they wanted to put the cock into the fowl house, he said no, the cock must sleep in the pen with the sheep. So they put the cock with the sheep. At midnight he got up, killed the cock, threw it back into the pen, and went back to bed. Next morning, when it was time for him to go away, his cock was dead, and he would not take anything for it but one of the best sheep. So they gave it to him, and he went off with it all that day, until nightfall, when he got to a village, where he again asked for a night's lodging, which was given to him. And when they wanted to put his sheep with the other sheep, he said no, the sheep must sleep with the cattle. So they put the sheep with the cattle. In the middle of the night he got up and killed the sheep, and went back to bed. Next morning he went for his sheep, which was dead. So he told them they must give him the best heifer for his sheep, and if they would not do so, he would go back and tell the king, who would come and make war on them. So, to get rid of him, they were glad to give him the heifer, and let him go. And away he went, and walked nearly all day with the heifer. Towards evening he met a funeral, and asked whose it was. One of the men said it was his sister, so he asked the men if they would let him have her. They said no, but after a while he begged so hard, saying he would give them the heifer, that they consented, and he took the dead body and walked away, carrying it until it was dark, when he came to a large town, where he went to a house and begged hard for a night's lodging for himself and his sister, who was so tired he was obliged to carry her, and they would be thankful if they would let them rest there that night. So they let them in, and he asked them to let them sit in the dark, as his sister could not bear the light. So they took them into a room, and left them in the dark. And when they were alone, he seated himself on a bench near the table, and put his sister close by his side, with his arm round her to keep her up. Presently they brought them in some supper. One plate he set before his sister, and put her hand in it, and the other plate for himself, but he ate out of both plates. When it was time to go to bed, he asked if they would allow his sister to sleep in a room where there were 12 strong men sleeping, for she had fits, and if she had one in the night, they would be able to hold her, and would not disturb the rest of the house. So they agreed to this, and he carried her in his arms, because he said she was so tired she was asleep, and laid her in a bed. He charged the men not to disturb her, and went himself to sleep in the next room. In the middle of the night he heard the men calling out, for they smelled a horrid smell, and tried to wake the woman. First one man gave her a blow, and then another, until all the men had struck her, but Anansi took no notice of the noise. In the morning, when he went in for his sister and found her dead, he declared they had killed her, and that he must have the 12 men. To this the townsmen said no, not supposing that all the men had killed her, but the men confessed that they had each given her a blow. So he would not be satisfied with less than the 12, and he carried them off to the king and delivered them up. End of section 70.